So I've been playing a lot of Windblown recently, and I feel like I finally reached a point where I'm able to rank the weapons from worst to best based on their performance in a run. Now, I've done quite a few runs in solo, and I've done quite a few runs in multiplayer, and I do have a few wins on both. I've actually started going deeper into the harder difficulties, and I feel like more so in the harder difficulties, this tier list is going to be true, whereas in the lower difficulties, you might get away using some of the lower tiered weapons. Just keep in mind that as you go higher and higher, the weapons that are lower on the tier list, you're going to have a lot of a harder time finding success with them. So straight out the gate, you'll notice that the beat bolt is already in its own tier straight at the top. The reason why I decided to put the beat bolt in its own tier above everything else is because I think the beat bolt is the kind of the golden standard for the weapons in Windblown. Developers, if you're watching this and you decide that you might need to buff and nerf some weapons based on feedback, just keep in mind that I feel like the beat bolt is what you should kind of go for when you're trying to get the feel of a weapon. The beat bolt does really good damage. The mini game is really fun to play. It's not annoying or egregious by any means. And I feel like this and pretty much the entire community has agreed that the beat bolt is just one of the most fun weapons out there. It feels strong, it feels good. So this is just your standard. Make sure that if you are going to be buffing and nerfing weapons, that you try to keep them in line with where the beat bolt is. So starting off, we have the weapon that you actually start the run with, which is going to be the fish knife. The fish knife it's okay. It has relatively low damage on the first and second swings, and the critical, to be honest, the damage on that is also pretty low. Because of the attack speed that the weapon has and the fact that it scales really decently with attack speed, because it's such a fast attacking weapon, you can get to the alterattack pretty quickly, so it can find its way into some builds that want to be doing a lot of alterattacks. Again, the damage isn't pathetic by any means, and for a starter weapon, it's pretty good. If you do decide to take it into late game, just keep in mind that you do want to get some affixes that increase the attack speed of it. But for the most part, its alterattack is decent for certain builds. It can get you 2 alterattacks relatively quickly. The damage is decent. Just keep in mind that you do need that attack speed buff if you want to be taking this thing into the late game. Overall, not a terrible weapon. The only thing that I would really change about this is maybe give it a little bit more damage, and that should fix it. Moving on, we have the Ravenblade. So the Ravenblade is good, but it's not good for the reasons that you'd expect. I don't actually think this weapon is weak, and I do think that it outperforms the fish knife, so I'm going to go ahead and put it here. But I will say that the weapon, in terms of feeling, it is lacking. The jump attack on the Ravenblade is actually quite powerful. You do the jump attack, it crits, it's an AoE, it covers distance, it's really strong. On top of that, the Ravenblade's alterattack is also really powerful. It gives you iframes, it gives you a bunch of crits, it does a bunch of damage. The reason why I don't think the Ravenblade is as good as it could be is because of the critical condition in the actual attack combo. So the 4th and 5th attack are the attacks that actually get to crit in the Ravenblade's combo. The thing about that is that the Ravenblade doesn't have a stagger effect on the attack like some of the heavier weapons like the Charge Blade or the Heavy Blade do. And also, you can't keep the attack going in between dashes. So what this means is that the Ravenblade has a very long attack chain combo with no way to really keep it going, so it's very hard to actually get to the 4th and 5th strikes. What I would do personally is I would make it so that you can keep the attack chain going even after dashes, and I would potentially also make it so that the Ravenblade staggers enemies after it hits them. Because in terms of how big the blade actually is, I feel like it would make sense to put it in the heavy weapons category, but that's really all it needs, to be honest. The jump attack damage is solid, the alter attack damage is solid. I don't think it's overtuned by any means. I just think that the Ravenblade itself needs to get to its critical condition in the attack chain combo easier. Another proposition would be maybe moving the criticals to every 3rd, 4th, and 5th attack rather than just the 4th and 5th attack. Moving on from there, we have the Sirocco. Now, I would personally rank the Sirocco above the Ravenblade just because I've realized that this thing becomes a scaling monster. Once you actually get the right stats for it, the Sirocco reaches a point where it can absolutely rip apart certain encounters without a lot of effort. The attack combo of the Sirocco does high damage. The alter attack of the Sirocco is, in my opinion, just straight up broken. Where the weapon lacks is the fact that the third attack in the attack chain combo is really egregiously slow. If I were to change anything about it, I would just speed up that last third attack just a teensy tiny bit to make it so that you can set enemies on fire easier, get your attacks in, and then start moving around, repositioning, dodging, stuff like that, right? The reason why the weapon feels bad right now is because the third attack is so slow that you don't get a lot of time to get off the burn before enemies are on top of you dealing damage to you. So a lot of encounters will look like you doing the first two attacks and then being forced to dodge, and then doing the first two attacks and being forced to dodge. You don't actually get a lot of time to get the third attack in. So if I were personally going to make some adjustments to the Sirocco, it would just be making it so that the third attack comes out a little bit faster to get its own crit condition rolling that much quicker. Mind you, in an optimal world, you have some other source of fire, like in your gifts or maybe in a trinket, but right now I feel like the Sirocco, especially with how little content there is in the game, because there aren't that many trinkets and gifts that actually enable fire, I would make it so that the Sirocco just feels better and gets to that third attack quicker. Moving on from there, we have the Katars. The Katars are going to be the first weapon that lands in the uh-oh Stinky tier. The reason why the Katars are uh-oh Stinky is because the Katars unfortunately don't work. So a lot of times the teleport behind you attack, that sometimes just won't work. A lot of times you'll be hitting an enemy in the back and it just won't crit. And the damage that the weapon outputs when you're not critting is not impressive whatsoever. I guess the reason for that is theoretically it's a weapon that you can get it to crit 100% of the time. Unfortunately, because the teleport behind you doesn't work and because the backstabs don't always work, you're really not getting 100% uptime on backstabs, even though every single enemy in this game does have a back that you can get crits off of. If I were going to change anything about the Katars, it wouldn't be to adjust the damage. If I were going to change anything about the Katars, it would just be that they make it so that the part of the enemy that is considered the back is a bit more forgiving, because right now it feels a little too tight. Some enemies, you'll hit them and you swear you're hitting them on the back, and for some reason you're just not critting. And I would also make it so that there's a little bit more visual clarity on what part of the attack chain combo you're on. So one of the issues that the Katars have is that it isn't super clear when you should be alter-attacking with them. What I mean by that is that when you use the teleports behind you move, it has a different amount of audio cues telling you that you've attacked a certain number of times. Normally you'll attack 4 times if you're not using the teleports behind you move, and that gets you to an alter attack. However, if you use the teleports behind you move, you'd expect it to be 5, but sometimes you hear 6 audio cues telling you that you've attacked 6 times, and then you'll get the alter attack. It's really inconsistent whether it's 5 or 6, and if the devs could just fix that bit of inconsistency, then I think the Katars would feel a lot better. Moving on from the Katars, we have the first weapon in the super good category. I'm a huge fan of the Heavy Blade. I feel like the Heavy Blade is the standard for what melee weapons in this game should be. The Heavy Blade, essentially what it does is it's a 4-hit attack combo, and the first hit actually staggers the enemies. What this means is that you can get the second hit off safely, and on top of that, it also maintains the attack chain even after a dash. So what you can do is you can attack, the enemy gets staggered, do the second attack. Once they come out of the stagger, they'll try to attack you. You can dash, reposition yourself, and then do the third and fourth attack. The whole combo is relatively high damage, and it has a really solid alter attack that you can put even in a ranged build because it's a ranged alter attack. And the moveset that the weapon has is just super satisfying. The damage is good, the affixes that it can get is good. The only adjustment that I would really make to the Heavy Blade is I would make it so that the very last attack, where you bring the blade over your head and slam it down onto the ground, the 4th attack in the combo, I would make it so that that has a little bit more range, because it feels like a lot of enemies will just be right in front of you and you just can barely not reach them with the last part of your attack, which is obviously the hardest hitting part of the attack, and you really want that to land. The Fish Knife actually has this weird interaction where even if an enemy is just barely outside of the attack range for the critical, even though you're not visually hitting them, the crit on the Fish Knife will still actually deal the damage. If they give the Heavy Blade some sort of mechanic like that, I think that that would go a long way for the weapon. Moving on from the heavy blade, we have the Boomerang. Now the Boomerang I think is actually in the easy win category, and the reason for this is because I think that the Boomerang is actually a really broken weapon. The reason why is not because it deals an insane amount of damage or anything. The damage on it is pretty mid, I'm gonna be honest with you. I feel like it could actually maybe be buffed. But the reason why the Boomerang is so overpowered in my opinion is because it's the only weapon that lets you spam alter attacks like crazy. What you can do with the Boomerang is you can actually throw it out and then immediately recall the Boomerang and instantly trigger the alter attack timing. So if you have another weapon in your secondary slot that has a ridiculous alter attack, you can pretty much just cheese the game by using the Boomerang to just crank out alter attacks from that super busted weapon. To any devs watching this, if you are going to adjust the Boomerang, what I would do is I would make it so that the actual damage of the Boomerang itself is just a little bit higher and more rewarding. I would also make it so that you can leave it out for longer, because right now it automatically returns to you after a very short set period of time. Make it so that you can leave it out for another 2 seconds or so, and maybe also make it so that it has a minimum duration that it has to be out. That way you can't just throw it out, immediately recall it, and then start triggering alter attacks for free. Next in line we have the Charge Blade. The Charge Blade is actually going to be super good in my opinion. The reason why the Charge Blade is super good is because it deals really high damage, and it's really easy to get the damage off as well, because the Charge Blade, much like the Heavy Blade, is a heavy weapon. What that means is that it staggers enemies when you actually hit them, so it's going to be really easy to attack an enemy with the first part of the attack, which by the way teleports you to that enemy, so you can start charging it out of range of the enemies where you're safe and out of danger, teleport directly onto them, hit them with the Charge Blade, they get staggered, and that gives you time to charge up the second and third attack. On top of that, despite being a weapon that actually needs to be charged, it actually gets to its alter attack relatively fast. So what that means is it's good with weapons that have really powerful alter attacks. I will say that its own alter attack is kind of lacking, and it is a little deceptive. What the alter attack on the Charge Blade does is it actually pushes enemies backwards, and it can potentially knock them off the stage. Most small enemies are going to die from this, but the thing is that a lot of the bigger enemies won't die from it, even though it really does feel like pushing an enemy off the stage should instantly kill them. I've seen it happen multiple times where a large enemy will get pushed off the stage by the Charge Blade, and then they immediately teleport back up onto the stage, hit you, you lose a bunch of HP, and you're like, what the hell, man? I really feel like that should have killed them. Moving on from the Charge Blade, we have the Ninja Stars. The Ninja Stars are much better after they received a little bit of quality of life to make them feel less janky. However, there is still some quality of life that I think that the Shurikens could be getting, and that mainly falls in the fact that the alter attack timing for the Shurikens is really awkward, and I've only noticed this with the Shurikens. But basically you'll do the full attack chain of the Shurikens and you get to the alter attack and then you press the button, and for whatever reason it just doesn't go off. You have to press the alter attack on a very specific frame, whereas with every other weapon, pretty much as soon as the alter attack icon pops up, you can press it and get the alter attack. I've only noticed this happen if you're actually attacking with the Shurikens to get to the alter attack. There doesn't seem to be any issues with the Shuriken's alter attack itself. The Shurikens don't have pathetic damage by any means, but I will say that the Shuriken damage is hard to get consistently, because the thing about the Shurikens is they do more damage based on the distance that you're away from the enemy. At max distance they do crit, but the thing about that is that enemies move in this game, so it's really hard to just constantly maintain your distance when things are constantly rushing at you. If you are able to maintain your distance, I think that the Shurikens can crank out some pretty nasty damage, but because of the fact that the Shurikens are really hard to keep their damage consistent on, and the fact that the Shurikens have that weird interaction with alter attacks, I'm going to say that the Shurikens are going to land themselves at the bottom of not the worst, but could use some buffs. Literally just fix the weird alter attack issue with the Shurikens and they're solid. Moving on from the Shurikens, we have the Eye Blade. The Eye Blade, I actually really like the weapon, but the reason why it's going to land itself in the uh-oh stinky tier is the very simple fact that the Eye Blade doesn't feel rewarding enough to actually swing the weapon around with. The reason I say this is because the Eye Blade actually has a relatively long attack chain combo, and even though it does feel satisfying to use, The problem with it is that it is very slow, and it's very hard to actually get the whole combo off. Now, just like the heavy blade and the charge blade, the eye sword is also a very visually heavy weapon, so I feel like it's perfectly fine to actually give it a stagger effect on the attack, at the very least the very first attack, to make it so that the rest of the attack chain combo is easier to pull off. Also, once you do actually pull off the whole combo and you get to the mark itself isn't doing a whole lot of damage. If the devs were going to adjust the eye blade to make it feel better, I would just give it more damage on the combo, more damage on the mark, and also make it so that the first attack in the combo chain actually staggers enemies, kind of like the heavy blade and the charge blade. This is a super fun weapon to use, and it has a really awesome alter attack, but it just needs a little bit of TLC from the devs. Next we have the Kunai, which I think land themselves at the bottom of the super good tier. Now, if you watch my Windblown demo video where I went over some of the problems that I have with the Kunai, you'll remember that the Kunai in the demo were really bad. However, the Kunai in the actual early access version of the game did get some adjustments from the developers to make them feel a lot better. Pretty much the entire weapon got reworked, everything from the attack combo to the alter attack, all are completely different from what they used to be, and they all feel 10 times better to use. And while I do think the Kunai are super good, I will say that I feel like the curse mechanic in the game could maybe use some adjustments. Ideally, you would leave the debuff on them for a little bit of time, maybe get some damage in with your primary weapon, or let your ally sink a bunch of damage into that enemy before you pop the stacks. And while that is doable right now, unfortunately it just feels like the stacks expire so quickly. And even with the gift that you can get that doubles the duration of your curses, it still feels pretty low. What I would do is I would personally make it so that curses go all the way up to like maybe 6 or 7 seconds, just to make this weapon feel better as a support weapon, because right now curses unfortunately just feel like they need to be popped more or less instantaneously as soon as you get the maximum curse stacks. And if you don't get to pop the curses on the Kunai, then you start missing out on a lot of extra damage. Another adjustment I would make to the curses is make it so that there's maybe like a timer that displays on top of the enemy to show you when the curses are about to expire, to give you more time to understand when you should be popping it, and how much time you have to hit the enemy for free while they're cursed, before you have to pop all the curses. So while the weapon itself feels really good, I would still adjust the curse mechanic to make the weapon feel a little bit better. Moving on from the Kunai, we actually have the shield, and I think the shield is going to land itself in the solid uh-oh Stinky. So the reason why the shield is uh-oh Stinky in my opinion is the fact that it doesn't really do anything. Parries in this game feel a lot worse than the parries in Dead Cells because you actually have to lower your guard in order to get the parry, which means that you're not blocking the damage in case you miss it. On top of that, the shield's alter attack is super underwhelming, and you really only use the shield in order to get the alter attacks of your primary weapon. Personally, I would rather just have another good weapon with another good alter attack than take the shield just to get the alter attack of my first good weapon. I really don't know what they could do to the shield to make it feel better other than give it a sword and turn the weapon from just shield into sword and shield and completely rework it into a new weapon. But I feel like that might be asking for a lot, and the truth is that I haven't really played with the shield that much, just for the simple fact that it is also incredibly boring. I don't really think the shield is weak, I just think that it's not really fun to use, and as you get into the later difficulties, you want your weapons to have really powerful alter attacks, and the shield unfortunately just doesn't have that. I'm actually going to move the shield over into not the worst, but could use some buffs, because performance-wise it's actually not that terrible. I think it just feels 10 times worse to me because it also isn't fun to use. Oh boy, I feel really bad for what I'm about to say about these weapons. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, the telespike is uh-oh Stinky. The reason why the telepike feels so bad is because the crit condition is super unforgiving. Your positioning has to be really perfect, and even though the telepike does have a mechanic built in to teach you the distance, the unfortunate truth is that enemies move around, and you're also forced to move around, so maintaining that distance constantly is just not feasible. It's the same issue that the shurikens have, but to a much greater degree and much more unforgiving. Not to mention, the teleport mechanic on the telepike is super boring. The only reason it exists is just to teach you the distance to achieve the weapon's crit condition. In my opinion, the teleport mechanic can be reworked to be made into something a lot more fun. If I were to suggest a rework for the teleport mechanic, I'd probably make it so that you can actually stab a telepike into the ground and have it as a sort of point on the screen where you could teleport to at any time by holding the button down. Imagine you're fighting the Sawblade robots and they do the attack in their combo where they launch themselves at you. The timing to dodge that attack is pretty unforgiving in my opinion, so being able to just teleport out of it because you put a telepike on the other side of the screen could be a really interesting and fun idea. And like I said before, I think that the crit condition is a little too unforgiving. I would make it so that the actual spear part of the weapon, regardless of where you hit it, fulfills the criticals, rather than just the tip of the spear. It would take a lot of the skill expression out of the weapon, but it would also mean that the weapon just becomes more fun to use, because right now, the minigame that you have to play with the weapon just isn't fun. Not to mention the damage even when you are critting with the weapon really isn't that impressive. I just want to use the beat bolt as an example here. The reason why the beat bolt feels good to people is because the minigame isn't a headache to play. The minigame, if anything, actually adds to the enjoyment of the weapon. If they could find a nice sweet spot to be able to pull that off with the telepike as well, and also rework the teleport mechanic into something more interesting than just being a bad tutorial, I think at that point the telepike would end up being super good. But it's definitely one of the weapons that I think needs the most attention from the devs, because just simple buffs are not going to make this thing feel any better. Starting off with the first competitor for worst weapon in the game, the Boomerang. The Boomerang has really nothing going for it. Every other ranged weapon in the game does its job better. The damage is low, the combo is egregiously slow, and the mortar strike that leaves fire on the ground, whilst very cool, is really impractical. I don't think this weapon needs to be reworked, but I do think that this weapon needs some serious buffs. The entire weapon is seriously lacking on damage. The third attack in the attack combo is egregiously slow. The alterattack for the weapon consists of 3 hits, and the first 2 hits feel like they shouldn't even be there. The only part of the alterattack that feels relevant at all is the big shotgun blast that it does, so in my opinion, the dev should just remove the first 2 attacks in that alterattack, and just leave you with the shotgun blast that does a bunch of damage. On top of that, I feel like the mortar strike should have maybe double or maybe even triple the range, and maybe even a wider radius, because even if this weapon did have a bunch of damage attached to it, it's really hard to justify the incredibly short range that the weapon does have, and the painfully slow attack combo. Developers, if you're watching this, this is one of the cooler weapons that you've designed. Please bring this thing up to speed, because I would absolutely love to crush runs with it. It just isn't there right now. Make it hit harder, make it faster, and make the mortar strike that it does feel more impactful. And the other contender for worst weapon on this tier list is going to be the Goo Brush. There is a slew of problems plaguing the Goo Brush. First and foremost, the first attack of the Goo Brush combo is actually slower than the Heavy Blade, which really doesn't feel like it should be the case. Goo isn't a bad status effect by any means, but the simple fact that it's on a melee weapon already makes it lose value, because I feel like the main reason to goo enemies is to glue them onto the ground so that you can use weapons like the shurikens or the kunai at a distance completely uninterrupted. But the 2 biggest reasons why the Goo Brush feels super unplayably bad. The first reason is the series of stab attacks in the attack combo. As soon as you initiate the stabs, you are locked in place and you can't dodge until that series of stabs is done. On top of that, the width of the stab attacks is really small and easy to whiff, even on enemies that are standing right in front of you. And even putting all these other grievances aside, the weapon really doesn't do crazy damage by any means. So you're not even rewarded well for using a weapon that feels super janky. Reason 2 why the weapon feels super bad is that the alterattack on the weapon is the same series of stabs that you do at the end of your attack combo. You have to be very close to the enemy to get any value out of the alterattack, and it's super prone to missing. And while I do think the goo mechanic is alright, I feel like it's not really delivering on the fantasy of a paintbrush. In my opinion, the weapon should get a secondary mechanic attached to it, kind of like how the Boomerang has with the mortar strike, where it leaves down that puddle of fire on the ground, but the Goo Brush could instead do something with goo puddles or ink puddles on the ground that the enemies could then step on and maybe become gooed. Right now, the Goo Brush just feels like a bad spear, and the spear already feels pretty terrible in my opinion. Hey, so while I was editing this video, I did decide to go back into Windblown after making this tier list, just to make sure that I wasn't being unfair to any of the weapons here. I did test out several of them, including the Goo Brush, and in defense of the Goo Brush, the single target damage is actually quite high if you hit the goo and all the stabs in the combo. Unfortunately, I forgot to mention that bosses and mini-bosses develop a resistance to being gooed after a certain amount of applications, making it much harder to actually deal damage with this weapon in those already difficult encounters. Taking this into consideration, I think that the Goo Brush actually is currently the worst weapon in the game, beating out the Boomerang. Once again, I want to reiterate that the Beat Bolt is not necessarily the best weapon in the game due to the fact that it has ridiculous damage or that it's super broken. I just think that the Beat Bolt is in its own tier because the Beat Bolt is such a fun weapon to use, and in my opinion should be the metric for the devs when they're adjusting or fine-tuning a weapon. I feel like it's really important for these weapons to be doing damage, delivering on their fantasy. For example, the heavy blade has to feel like a heavy blade. The paintbrush needs to feel like a paintbrush. And weapons like the charge blade should be doing exactly what the name suggests, which is you charging the weapon up to get more damage off. And if the weapon isn't going to be doing more damage or playing into a certain fantasy, it should be doing its job as a support weapon like the kunais. The kunai are by no means a damage powerhouse, but the kunai do play into being a very good support weapon because of the debuff that they apply onto the enemies. Devs, if you are watching this, I've given my recommendations on what I think the weapon should get in terms of adjustments. And for anyone else watching this, just keep in mind that this tier list is subjective. This is just my personal opinion on the runs that I've done with these weapons. Anyway, that's the tier list, and that's going to be it for this video. Good luck out there, Leapers.